Welcome to this deep dive. We're going to pull back the curtain today on, well, an absolutely wild topic, this idea of a new world map. We're focusing particularly on the Middle East and South Asia. Here's the basic idea. About, 2 years ago, some pretty bold predictions surfaced about Pakistan's geopolitical endgame, looking at maybe 2027, 2028. And, at the time, people were pretty skeptical, understandably so. But what's really striking now is how some of those, let's say, far-fetched ideas are actually starting to, well, materialize. We're basing this deep dive on a whole stack of strategic analyses, insights from military strategists, intelligence circles, quite a bit of material.
Absolutely. And our mission today really is to try and pull out the critical insights from these frankly complex predictions, see how they're actually playing out right now, and maybe understand what could come next. It is genuinely fascinating, isn't it? Watching these things that seemed purely hypothetical start to become, well, reality unfolding.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Yeah.
Where did these provocative maps even come from? The first big one, Colonel Ralph Peters' map. This goes back originally to 1998, but it got published widely in 2006 in the Armed Forces Journal. Visually, it's pretty stark. You've got areas in red, they lose territory. Areas in black, they gain. Think Turkey, Pakistan, even Yemen looking much smaller. But the real head-turner, I think, is Saudi Arabia being carved up. I mean, that flies in the face of the whole U.S.-Saudi strategic alignment we always assume is rock solid.
Right. It suggests that maybe these strategists saw other pressures, internal stuff, succession maybe, resources, shifting energy demands as being powerful enough to potentially fracture even those really strong historic alliances.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's really crucial to get the context for Peter's work. He was a lieutenant colonel at the time, had some involvement, people might remember, in the Iran-Contra affair, later joined the Republican Party. His strategic thinking is very much linked to this powerful think tank, the Project for the New American Century, PNAC. This group formed in 96. It actually grew out of an earlier idea, Pax Americana, from after 92. And PNAC's goal was, well, pretty clear: ensure American global dominance in the 21st century. And an interesting aside, actually, Raghuram Rajan, the economist, was apparently one of the founder mentors for their economic security pillar.
Interesting connection. And Peter's map isn't the only game in town, right? We also have insights from Bernard Lewis, the military historian. Very influential figure.
That's right. And Lewis's map, well, it has some really unique features. He envisions a separate Pashtunistan, for instance, and it stretches quite far north into Tajikistan, even touching China's Xinjiang region. Turkmenistan gains territory in his view. Iran is shown with an Arabistan and a kind of Shia Iraq inside it. And what's really striking, Israel is shown gaining almost the entire Mediterranean coast of Syria. Syria is left with just a tiny opening to the sea. Plus, you see the creation of Kurdistan, Azerbaijan gaining big chunks of Persia. But the constant theme, the really critical insight across both Peters and Lewis, Pakistan losing significant territory. That's the big takeaway. And this isn't just, lines on a map changing. It's a forecast of a nation really struggling. Deep internal fragility, external pressures, hitting a kind of geopolitical breaking point.
Okay, so let's bring that forecast into the present day. Let's look at the immediate situation in Pakistan. The U.S. seems to be a really central player now. You used that phrase before we started, like Pakistan is sort of dependent, almost subservient to the U.S. now.
Well, the U.S. definitely holds a very strategic position in Afghanistan, that's for sure, especially after pulling out in 2021, but leaving behind, let's be honest, a huge amount of weaponry. So yeah, many see the U.S. as effectively holding the sword of Afghanistan now. And groups like the TTP, the Tehrik-i-Taliban, Pakistan, and the BLA, the Balochistan Liberation Army, they're like the blades being wielded against Pakistan. A lot of people are framing this as basically payback time for Pakistan's past support, for the Taliban, for al-Qaeda against the U.S. and ISF forces back in the day. And its significant reports suggest around 14,000 Americans, both public and private sector, are still in Afghanistan, helping sustain those arms caches, presumably.
And internally, Pakistan's facing huge challenges, too.
Yes.
Right? The economy is in deep trouble. We saw Microsoft pulling out its operations, for example.
Ooh.
Plus that controversial report from a retired CIA officer suggesting Pakistan's nuclear assets are effectively under American generals' control. That's a big claim.
It is, and Pakistan is definitely facing immense international pressure. There's talk of potential blacklisting or maybe graylisting again because of violations of dual-use technology bans. Just to clarify for listeners, dual use means tech with civilian uses like electronics or chemicals that could be diverted for military stuff. Breaking those rules, that really hurts access to global markets, finance, and we've seen actual examples. India intercepted a ship, 5 years ago? Documentation, funding, traced right back to Pakistan involving this kind of tech. The Pahalgam incident, too, that major attack in Kashmir, the funding, the control, all traced back to Pakistan. And then you see these symbolic things, but they're very telling. Senior Pakistani military commanders, the corps commanders, attending funerals of terrorists whose bodies are wrapped in Pakistani flags. It sends a message. All these visits lately, international financial bodies, State Department officials, it seems very likely they're discussing financial compensation, basically, for the territorial losses Pakistan is expected to suffer.
You coined a term for this, didn't you? A really striking one. Somaliaization. Why that specific analogy? Why not balkanization or something else?
Right. Because terms like balkanization, that implies a big holding power collapses, like the Soviet Union breaking up led to Yugoslavia fragmenting. That doesn't quite fit. And Lebanonization, that's usually about a demographic shift, one group taking power. Also not quite Pakistan's situation, but Somalia. That analogy, fractured control, seems much more precise. You look at Somalia, you have regions like Puntland, Somaliland operating pretty much autonomously. The central government has very little real power there. You can draw parallels, I think, to Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, KP, and the Fata areas. Reports suggest the Pakistani army is hesitant, even afraid, to go into places like Chitral or Swat. That speaks volumes about central authority. And then Gilgit-Baltistan, GB, that disputed region, it's kind of like the areas contested between Somaliland and Puntland. You've got the Pakistani army, China, the U.S., all vying for influence there. And honestly, even in the core provinces, Punjab and Sindh, the government's hold feels pretty tenuous. So this Somaliaization, it's not just about internal chaos. It creates this power vacuum that inevitably external players are going to try and fill.
Right. And Pakistan's internal strife obviously has massive knock-on effects regionally, especially for China's huge project, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC. So what does this all mean for CPEC? Is it finished?
Well, quite directly, yeah. CPEC investments look effectively sunk, or like you said, a dead duck. Given all this turmoil, it raises that critical question. Can China even sustain its presence in Wadar Port if there's no secure land link? Especially if Balochistan gets more autonomy or even independence, the whole basis of their access is, well, crumbling.
And there's that interesting detail near Gwadar, too, those American F-16s at PASNY. The advanced AESA radars. For people listening, AESA radars, active electronically scanned array, they're incredibly sophisticated. Track lots of targets with high precision, far beyond older radar tech. Having them right there implies all that detailed operational data is going straight back to the U.S. It kind of reminds me of India managing to ping those advanced U.S. F-35s with their own radars a while back.
Exactly. And this links into China's wider strategic worries. They really fear a third front opening up on their Xinjiang border. And the Uyghur fighters are a critical piece of this. Reports suggest about 5,000 of the original maybe 10,000 who fought in Syria and Iraq are back in Afghanistan now, waiting potentially to enter Xinjiang. And this is all happening against that terrible backdrop of human rights abuses against Uyghurs inside China, the education camps, concentration camps, really forced organ harvesting, uterine removal, truly awful stuff. So China's been trying hard to secure the Wakhan corridor, that narrow strip in Tajikistan, building military posts, joint patrols, but significantly, their offer to fund an Afghan brigade right at the mouth of the Wakhan. Rejected by the U.S., by ISAF before, and now even by the Taliban. And then crucially, the Taliban recently canceled China's big oil exploration deal in Abu Darya. That's a major hit to their Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. So ultimately, China wants control over Gilgit-Baltistan, partly because it gives them leverage over that Wakhan corridor. It's a vital strategic choke point for them.
Okay, let's pivot then. What's India's perspective in all this shifting sand? We know India has its own map claims, including Aksai Chin. What are the strategic options on the table for India?
India has some pretty compelling options regarding Gilgit-Baltistan, GB, option 1. Basically, take full control of GB. The geostrategic value is immense. First, it directly blocks that China-Pakistan land connection. Second, it gives India a vital land corridor straight into Central Asia via passes like Mitka, Isram, Borgil. Third, it effectively solves the whole Siachen Glacier issue. You wouldn't need troops up there anymore. And fourth, direct connectivity to Afghanistan, bypassing Pakistan entirely. Taking GB would be a massive blow to CPEC, obviously, and directly challenge the Chinese PLA presence there. Now, the main challenge, you'd share a direct border with a potentially radical Afghanistan under Sharia law. That's a risk. But maybe leaving the rest of what's called Pakistan-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, POJK, to Pakistan could be acceptable to the U.S. It gives Islamabad some strategic depth, perhaps.
That's a huge move, taking all of GB. But there's another option too, right? Even more complex, perhaps.
Indeed. Option 2 is, well, arguably even more transformative. It involves taking GB and at the same time facilitating the creation of an independent state of Sindh. Think about what that does. It leaves Pakistan essentially as a landlocked West Punjab, highly dependent on India for its basic survival, trade routes, everything. The Karachi problem, meaning the instability and complexity of managing Karachi. Perhaps the Balochistan Liberation Army, the BLA, could handle that, some argue. And it's important to stress independent Sindh and Balochistan wouldn't necessarily be inherently radical. They'd likely form out of existing Pakistani territory, maybe some Afghan areas mixed in. Plus, this setup creates a very clear, defensible border along the Indus River with whatever Islamic State remains to the west.
This really underscores India's growing confidence, doesn't it? That philosophy you mentioned, not just punching at its weight, but actively increasing its weight before punching. We've seen signs of it asserting economic sovereignty, like refusing GM crops and trade deals. And you hear more talk now in the West about India, not China, being the new power in Asia.
Absolutely. And this strategic thinking isn't just westward looking. India is also considering options, hypothetically at least, on its eastern front. For instance, taking control of maybe 3 provinces in Bangladesh Rampur, Rangshahhi, right up to the Brahmaputra and Ganges rivers. Also incorporating the Feni River East area and the entire Chittagong region. Strategically, that would be massive. It would hugely secure the Siliguri corridor, that vulnerable chicken neck, and the whole northeast region. Plus, it gives security depth looking towards North Myanmar.
Okay, so let's zoom out again. Connect all this South Asian flux to the bigger picture. Bernard Lewis had wider visions too, right? Restructuring Muslim countries across Asia.
He absolutely did. Look at Iraq. Right now, you have a Shia-dominated state run from Baghdad, but with historically little real control over the Sunni desert areas where ISIS operated, for instance. Iran has always had this ambition to integrate more closely with the Shia Iraq. That really provides the context, for why Soleimani was killed in Baghdad. It was about disrupting that Iranian strategic push. Then the Kurds, they've achieved a kind of virtual independence already in places like Kirkuk and Mosul in Iraq and northeast Syria. The maps consistently show them gaining more autonomy. And their desire extends to Kurdish areas in Iran and Turkey, too. The potential for a unified Kurdistan is definitely part of this thinking. Now, Palestine and Israel. It's fascinating that Ralph Peters' 1998 map showed no distinct Palestinian state in Israel with its 1967 borders. It really makes you question the whole global two-state theory, doesn't it? Especially when nobody seems to specify where exactly that second state would be. Some potential ideas floated are locating a Palestinian entity in South or North Sinai. And you hear reports Egypt has already been, let's say, arm-twisted into taking over 1 million Palestinian refugees. Plus, these future plans for a Ben Gurion Canal, a new canal from the Gulf of Aqaba up to Gaza with a new port. If that happens, Israel would almost certainly need to control parts of Sinai just for security along that route. That canal, if built, would be a huge geopolitical shift, potentially making the Suez Canal the effective border between Israel and Egypt.
Wow. Okay, what about the rest of the Levant? And the Arabian Peninsula itself?
Right. In Lebanon, the idea often discussed is a free Lebanon, maybe returning to being a Christian-majority country, and possibly a greater Lebanon taking over Syria's entire Mediterranean coastline that's the Alawite heartland. Strategically, this could be linked to an oil pipeline idea. Running from Kurdistan, through Syria near Tartus, and straight to the Med, bypassing Turkey entirely as an export route. Jordan, in these projections, often gains significant territory from Syria. Maybe to accommodate Palestinians moved from elsewhere, or perhaps just as part of a regional power rebalance. It also connects to Jordan's historical identity as the Hashemite kingdom, descended from the Prophet Muhammad's tribe. Iran, despite its own regional power plays, is often shown losing its coastal areas along the Persian Gulf. These would go to a new Shia Arab state. The logic seems to be the existing Shia populations already living in those coastal regions, an ethnic and sectarian realignment, essentially.
Yeah.
And Saudi Arabia, the predictions here are really dramatic. Coastal areas on both the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea potentially being ceded to some sort of Islamic secret state. This touches on that idea of Mecca and Medina becoming almost like a Vatican within a country, independent, internationally managed cities purely for pilgrims. There's also speculation Saudi Arabia might need to control Yemen's Aden port and Red Sea coast, simply due to the ongoing piracy from Somalia and the Houthi attacks disrupting shipping, securing those vital sea lanes. Lewis's map does show Yemen significantly reduced. Overall, the rationale behind many of these proposed changes seems to boil down to controlling resources, trade routes, and managing sectarian demographics.
So after all that, what does this actually mean for you, the listener, and for the future? We've really dug into this core idea of strategic remapping today, and the implications are just profound. They stretch across some of the most vital and volatile regions on the planet.
Yeah, and it's crucial to remember these aren't things expected to happen overnight. Most projections see these kinds of shifts playing out over, say, the next 5 to 6 years. It's a longer-term game. What this deep dive really highlights, I think, is just how important critical thinking is. We need to understand these incredibly complex geopolitical dynamics and how they might impact global security, the economy, everything, really, which raises, I suppose, an important final question.
Exactly. Given how ambitious these geopolitical blueprints are and how incredibly fluid global power is right now, how much of this future is actually set in stone? How inevitable is it? And how much can individual nations, through their own strategic choices, actually shape their own destinies when faced with forecasts like these? Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.